Rome on the brink. Rome was a city bursting with pride but cracking under pressure. Its armies had conquered most of the Mediterranean, its wealth was staggering, and its senators liked to remind the world that Rome was still a republic, a state where no single man ruled. But under the marble surface, Rome was boiling. The old system wasn't working anymore. Ordinary Romans filled the streets, restless and poor. Veterans returned from war demanding land and pensions that were promised but never delivered. Senators bickered, blocked reforms, and clung to power like their lives depended on it. And into this chaos stepped a new kind of Roman politician, the kind who didn't just argue in the Senate, but marched at the head of armies, using soldiers as bargaining chips. This was not brand new. A generation earlier, the general Marius had changed the game by recruiting poor men into the legions with the promise of loot. Then came Sulla, who shocked Rome by doing the unthinkable. He marched his soldiers into the city itself. Civil war followed, and when Sulla won, he ruled as a dictator, killing enemies at will and rewriting the rules. Rome survived him, but it was never the same. Now everyone knew the Republic could be bent, even broken, by a man with enough soldiers behind him. By the 60s BCE, one man towered over all others, Pompey the Great. He had risen young and fast, riding Sulla's coattails at first, then carving out a name for himself with brilliant campaigns. Pirates once terrorized the Mediterranean, strangling Rome's trade routes. Pompey cleared them out in just a few months. Then he marched east and crushed mighty kings, expanding Roman power further than ever before. To many Romans, Pompey wasn't just a general, he was a savior. He was rich, famous, and adored by his men. People said he was lucky, as if the gods themselves walked with him. But popularity in Rome was a double-edged sword. The Senate, filled with cautious old men, feared Pompey's fame. They refused to grant him everything he wanted: land for his soldiers, recognition of his eastern settlements, because they worried he was becoming too powerful. Pompey, the Great, stood at the peak of his career, but even he could feel the resistance. And in the shadows, another man was climbing. His name was Julius Caesar. Unlike Pompey, Caesar was not yet the great conqueror of legend. He came from an old but struggling aristocratic family, weighed down with debts. Yet he had something more valuable than wealth: ambition that burned hotter than anyone else's. Clever, charming, daring, Caesar knew how to win crowds and how to make allies. He defended ordinary people when others sneered at them, and he spoke with a fire that stirred emotions. Some thought him dangerous, others thought him Rome's future. Caesar and Pompey were different in many ways, but in one sense they were the same. Neither man could be satisfied with half measures. Both wanted more than offices, more than riches. They wanted history to remember them as Rome's greatest. Rome, meanwhile, was splitting down the middle. The optimates, the best men, as they called themselves, stood for the Senate and tradition. The populares, the men of the people, fought for reforms and used public support to challenge the aristocrats. Caesar leaned toward the populares. Pompey, though once their champion, drifted closer to the Senate's camp when it suited him. The stage was set for a clash, but no one yet knew how fierce it would become. By 60 BCE, two storms were gathering. Pompey stood as the unrivaled general of his age, but one step short of total dominance. Caesar, restless and ambitious, was on the rise, seeking his first great stage. Rome had seen rivalries before, but this one was different. The stakes were higher, the personalities larger, and the system weaker. The Republic was still breathing, still functioning. Consuls were elected, laws were passed, speeches thundered in the Senate. But it was fragile. The machinery of the old Republic had been built to keep any single man from becoming king. Yet, soon, the Republic would learn that it could not contain the ambitions of two giants. And so the city of Rome stood on the brink. Its fate, whether it would endure as a republic or collapse into something new, would soon be decided, not by law or tradition, but by the feud between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. Pompey the Great, a star ascendant. When Romans called someone Magnus, the Great, they didn't hand out the title lightly. Pompey earned it, and he earned it young. In fact, he was still in his 20s when his soldiers first hailed him with that name. By the standards of Roman politics, where careers were usually a slow climb up the ladder of offices, Pompey's rise was like a lightning bolt. He came from wealth, yes, but not from one of the oldest or most prestigious families. What set Pompey apart was his instinct for survival in dangerous times. As a teenager, he watched Rome torn apart by the struggle between Marius and Sulla, two generals who turned their armies on their own country. Pompey quickly chose Sulla's side. He raised troops from his family's estates, fought bravely, and impressed the dictator so much that Sulla jokingly called him the Teenage Butcher. It wasn't the most flattering nickname, but it showed Pompey had arrived. By his mid-20s, Pompey had already commanded armies in Africa and Spain. He was too young to legally hold the offices that usually gave men the right to lead, but that didn't stop him. His victories were undeniable, and in Rome, nothing spoke louder than success. The Senate bent the rules for him, again and again. Pompey was a man for whom tradition seemed to melt away. What really made Pompey shine, though, was his eastern campaigns. In 67 BCE, Rome faced a crisis. Pirates controlled the Mediterranean, choking off grain shipments, threatening trade, even raiding the coasts of Italy itself. The Senate was hesitant, but the people voted Pompey extraordinary powers to deal with the problem. Many expected a long, grueling fight. Pompey solved it in 3 months. 3. He divided the sea into zones, sent his fleets out like a net, and swept the pirates away. Rome had never seen such efficiency. But Pompey wasn't done. With his command extended, he turned east to finish Rome's long war with Mithridates of Pontus, a king who had resisted Roman domination for decades. By 63 BCE, Mithridates was dead, and Pompey had reorganized vast new territories, bringing Syria and Judea into Rome's orbit. He returned home with treasure, influence, and glory that no man of his generation could match. Pompey's triumph, Rome's grandest victory parade, lasted 2 full days. Exotic animals, endless wagons of loot, and captured kings were displayed to the cheering crowds. He had extended Rome's empire further than anyone before him. People whispered that he was the new Alexander the Great. Yet for all his victories abroad, Pompey faced a problem back in Rome. Success made him powerful, but it also made him dangerous in the eyes of the Senate. The old aristocrats mistrusted him. They feared that a man so adored by the army and the people might dream of ruling like a king. When Pompey asked for land grants for his veterans and ratification of his eastern settlements, the Senate dragged its feet, blocking and delaying. This was the contradiction at the heart of Pompey's career. He could conquer foreign kings with ease, but in Rome, he found himself outmaneuvered by cautious, jealous senators. Pompey was a master of war, but not yet a master of politics. Still, he had something no one else had: an aura. Romans saw him as a man touched by fortune, someone destined for greatness. His very presence seemed to tilt the balance of power, and that made him irresistible, but also threatening to everyone around him. For now, Pompey remained the towering figure in Roman public life. He had wealth, glory, and an army of veterans who worshipped him. But what he lacked was the one thing every Roman general eventually needed: reliable allies in politics. Without that, even the great could be brought low. And as Pompey searched for partners to secure his position, a man named Julius Caesar was waiting in the wings, ambitious, charming, and ready to make himself indispensable. Caesar's rise, ambition, and opportunity. If Pompey was the golden boy of Roman fortune, Julius Caesar was the gambler who played with loaded dice. Where Pompey rose quickly with victories, Caesar clawed his way up through charm, daring, and sheer audacity. His story is one of debts, deals, and an ambition so relentless that nothing, not tradition, not rivals, not even fear of death, could slow him down. Caesar was born into a patrician family, the old aristocracy of Rome, but his branch of the Julians had little power left. In his youth, he married into the family of Marius, Sulla's great rival, which nearly cost him his life when Sulla took power. Sulla spared him reluctantly, saying, "In that young man, I see many Mariuses." It was meant as a warning. Caesar carried the spark of revolution. He grew up with that mark on his head, but instead of shying away, he leaned into it. He became known as bold, reckless even, but magnetic. He spoke with a natural fire, and crowds loved him. His enemies sneered that he was too extravagant, too theatrical. He wore his toga too loosely, cared too much for his hair, spent fortunes he didn't have. But what they called weaknesses were actually weapons. Caesar understood image. He understood that in Rome, winning hearts was just as important as winning votes. His early career was full of clever moves. As a young prosecutor, he made a name by going after corrupt governors. He held priesthoods, curule offices, each step bringing him closer to power. But behind the scenes, he was sinking into staggering debt, borrowing from Rome's richest men to fund lavish games and public spectacles. Caesar once said money was like soldiers. You needed to spend them to win victories. For him, debt was not a trap, but an investment in future glory. What Caesar wanted most was a great command, an army, a stage on which to prove himself. But before he could reach that, he needed the consulship, the highest office of the Republic. To get there, he needed friends in high places, and Caesar was a master at making alliances. He befriended Marcus Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, who paid off some of his debts in exchange for political support. And he reached out to Pompey the Great, who, despite his fame, was struggling to get the Senate to approve settlements for his veterans. This was Caesar's genius. He saw how isolated Pompey had become, how even a man so powerful could be stymied without allies. Caesar offered him a deal. But he didn't stop there. He also brought Crassus into the fold, tying Rome's richest man to Rome's greatest general. In 60 BCE, this alliance, later nicknamed the First Triumvirate, was born. It was not an official office, not a legal body. It was an understanding. 3 men pooling their resources to dominate Roman politics. For Caesar, this was a masterstroke. He secured the consulship of 59 BCE with their backing. Once in office, he showed Rome what kind of consul he would be. He pushed through land reforms for Pompey's veterans, reduced taxes for Crassus's allies, and gave himself a prize, a 5-year command in Gaul, Rome's wild frontier. The Senate fumed, but they were powerless to stop him. Caesar had turned his debts and charm into raw political muscle. When his consulship ended, Caesar rode north to begin the campaign that would make his name immortal. The Gallic Wars would last nearly a decade, bringing him unimaginable wealth, an army fiercely loyal to him, and the reputation of a conqueror. But that was still to come. At this moment in the story, Caesar was not yet the Caesar of legend. He was a man in his late 30s, still proving himself, still haunted by rivals who dismissed him as reckless. Yet even then, those who looked closely could see it. He was never going to stop at consul or general or rich man. Caesar wanted everything, and soon that hunger would bring him into collision with Pompey, the man who had once been his ally, and would become his greatest rival. The First Triumvirate, marriage of convenience. Roman politics was never gentle, but in 60 BCE it became a blood sport. The Senate was divided, the people were restless, and 3 men decided to put aside their differences, at least for a while, to control it all. Their partnership was not born of friendship or shared ideals. It was born of need, ambition, and convenience. This was the First Triumvirate: Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Crassus. On paper, they could not have been more different. Pompey, already the Great, was the most celebrated general of his generation. He had conquered lands stretching from Spain to the edges of Asia. Yet, for all his victories abroad, he was frustrated at home. The Senate refused to ratify the settlements he had made in the East, and they blocked land grants for his loyal veterans. Pompey, the conqueror of kings, was being humiliated by a room full of cautious senators. Crassus, meanwhile, was Pompey's opposite in almost everything except ambition. Where Pompey had glory, Crassus had gold, mountains of it. He was said to be the richest man in Rome, a man who could buy entire neighborhoods and bankroll armies. But wealth did not bring him respect. Senators snickered that Crassus was greedy, that he lacked the heroic sheen of Pompey. He longed for military victories of his own, something to put him on the same level as his rival. And then there was Caesar. Compared to the other two, he seemed the underdog. He had charm and daring, but not yet the glory of Pompey or the wealth of Crassus. What he had, though, was political genius. He could see what others could not. That Pompey and Crassus, though rivals, were both isolated. The Senate mistrusted Pompey. The Senate mocked Crassus. If Caesar could bring them together, he could harness their power for himself, and in return, give each of them what they wanted. So Caesar worked his magic. He convinced Pompey that Crassus's money and influence could break the Senate's resistance. He convinced Crassus that Pompey's armies and fame could balance Pompey's own ambition with his own, and he offered himself as the glue that would hold the alliance together. The deal was sealed with bonds stronger than words. Caesar married off his daughter Julia to Pompey, a marriage that, unusually for Roman politics, was marked by genuine affection. Crassus, for his part, poured money into Caesar's debts, ensuring Caesar had the resources to run for the consulship of 59 BCE. And Pompey brought his soldiers and prestige to the table, ready to back Caesar's political program. Together, they were unstoppable. Caesar won the consulship, and once in office, he showed just how far he was willing to go. He forced through Pompey's land reforms, ignoring the Senate's objections. He secured tax reductions and financial breaks for Crassus's allies, and most importantly, he arranged for his own reward, a 5-year governorship in Gaul, complete with command of legions. It was exactly what he needed, an arena to win military glory and build an army loyal to him alone. The Senate fumed. Cato the Younger, the Republic's fiercest defender, railed against the trio's power grab. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, warned that this kind of backroom deal was the death of Republican liberty. But their voices were drowned out. The people loved Caesar's flair. Pompey's veterans got their land. Crassus grew richer and more influential, and Caesar, with both of them at his side, seemed untouchable. But under the surface, cracks were already forming. Pompey and Crassus despised each other, and their rivalry never truly faded. Caesar could smooth things over, but he could not erase the suspicion. And while Caesar's marriage of Julia to Pompey kept the bond tight for now, everyone in Rome knew that marriages ended, alliances shifted, and fortunes changed. For the moment, though, Rome was ruled not by laws or institutions, but by 3 men who bent both to their will. It was a fragile alliance, tied together by ambition and convenience. And as history would soon show, ambition is the most dangerous glue of all. Gaul, glory, and growing suspicion. When Caesar rode north in 58 BCE to take command of his provinces in Gaul, few in Rome suspected just how much this new chapter would change him, or the Republic. Officially, he was governor of Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, Illyricum, the Adriatic coast, and Transalpine Gaul, southern France. It sounded respectable enough, but not earth-shattering. Yet beyond those provinces lay the rest of Gaul, a vast land of Celtic tribes, rich in resources, proud and fiercely independent. To Caesar, it looked less like a governorship and more like an open stage. And Caesar, more than anyone, knew how to turn a stage into a theater. His first campaigns came almost by accident. In 58 BCE, the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe, tried to migrate westward across Roman lands. Caesar, quick to seize opportunity, blocked them, fought them, and forced them back. He wrote about it later with flair, painting himself as the protector of Rome, the man who stopped dangerous hordes from flooding Italy. From there, one campaign flowed into the next. Germanic tribes under Ariovistus were crushed. Belgic tribes in the north were subdued. The Veneti, who ruled the sea with their tough little ships, were beaten in a dramatic naval battle. Each victory was bigger than the last, each one adding to Caesar's legend. The climax came in 52 BCE, when almost all of Gaul united under a young chieftain named Vercingetorix. He was smart, brave, and determined to resist Rome's iron grip. At first, he scored victories, using scorched earth tactics to starve Caesar's forces. But then came the siege of Alesia, where Caesar built miles of fortifications to trap Vercingetorix and his allies inside, while holding off reinforcements outside. It was a double wall of earthworks, a masterpiece of Roman engineering. Against all odds, Caesar won. Vercingetorix surrendered, reportedly laying his weapons at Caesar's feet in one of the most dramatic moments of ancient history. By the time the Gallic Wars ended, Caesar had done more than conquer Gaul. He had turned himself into the greatest military figure of his age. He gained staggering wealth through plunder, enough to repay his debts, and then some. More importantly, he gained an army, seasoned veterans who adored him. They had marched with him through mud and snow, shared his risks, and grown rich on his victories. To them, Caesar was not just a general. He was a father, a leader, a man touched by destiny. Back in Rome, however, the mood was shifting. Caesar's reports of his victories, written in his commentaries on the Gallic War, circulated widely. They were crisp, dramatic, and self-serving, propaganda disguised as history. Romans devoured them, and Caesar's fame soared. To the people, he was a hero. To the Senate, especially the conservatives, he was becoming dangerous. A man with money, glory, and an army at his back was a threat to the fragile balance of the Republic. Meanwhile, the triumvirate that had lifted Caesar to power was crumbling. Crassus marched east in search of his own glory, but was killed in 53 BCE at the disastrous Battle of Carrhae. His death removed the one man who balanced Caesar and Pompey. Julia, Caesar's beloved daughter and Pompey's wife, died in childbirth, breaking the personal bond that had tied the two men together. The glue of the alliance was gone. Pompey, now older and more cautious, drifted toward the Senate and the conservative camp. He was still respected as Rome's greatest general, but Caesar's victories in Gaul had begun to overshadow even his own. The two men, once allies, began to eye each other with suspicion. By 50 BCE, the Senate demanded that Caesar give up his command and return to Rome. They wanted him back as a private citizen, stripped of the legal immunity his office gave him. Caesar knew what that meant: trials, prosecutions, and political ruin. He could not return without losing everything he had fought for. And so, the seeds of civil war were planted. Caesar had built an empire in Gaul, but in doing so, he had created an enemy just as formidable: Pompey, backed by the Senate, waiting in Rome. The Republic could not hold them both. The Rubicon, from rivalry to civil war. By the year 50 BCE, Rome was no longer big enough for two giants. Caesar had spent nearly a decade conquering Gaul, piling up victories and treasure, and winning the kind of loyalty from his soldiers that made senators in Rome shiver. Pompey, once the unchallenged star of Roman glory, now found himself in his rival's shadow. He still commanded respect, but Caesar had stolen the spotlight. What had begun as an alliance had hardened into suspicion, and suspicion was about to turn into open war. The death of Crassus had shattered the balance of the old triumvirate. Without him, the partnership between Caesar and Pompey became less a friendship and more a tug of war. Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, had been a bridge between them, softening tensions. But her death in childbirth ended even that fragile bond. By the late 50s BCE, the two men were no longer allies. They were competitors, each aware that the other could not be trusted. The Senate seized the chance to pull Pompey closer. Pompey accepted. He was made consul without a colleague in 52 BCE, a rare honor, but also a sign that Rome's institutions were breaking down. As mobs rioted in the streets and political violence spun out of control, Pompey presented himself as the stabilizer, the man who could restore order. He began to side more openly with the Optimates, the conservative senators who feared Caesar's growing power. For Caesar, the stakes could not have been higher. His governorship in Gaul was nearing its end. By law, when a governor's term expired, he had to give up his command and return to Rome. But Caesar knew what awaited him there. His enemies had been sharpening their knives for years, ready to prosecute him for abuses of power during his consulship and strip away his fortune, maybe even his life. Caesar could not step down safely unless he had another office waiting, something to protect him legally. So he tried to bargain. He offered to lay down his command if Pompey did the same. He suggested compromises. But behind every word was the same truth. Caesar would not return to Rome as a powerless private citizen. His enemies in the Senate, led by Cato and others, would never forgive him. In January of 49 BCE, the Senate made its move. Backed by Pompey, they passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree, which gave Pompey and the consuls extraordinary powers to defend the state. They ordered Caesar to disband his army and return home immediately. Caesar's choice was stark: obey and face ruin, or resist and plunge Rome into civil war. On the banks of a small river in northern Italy, the Rubicon, the decision came. It was the boundary between his province and Italy itself. To cross it with an army was treason, a declaration of war against the Republic. Ancient writers tell us Caesar hesitated, aware of the enormity of what he was about to do. Then, with his soldiers waiting, he stepped forward. "The die is cast," he is said to have declared. And with that, he led his men across the Rubicon. The news hit Rome like a thunderclap. Panic swept the city. Senators scrambled to flee. Pompey, caught off guard, ordered a retreat. He claimed he could not defend Rome itself and marched south to gather his forces. Citizens watched in disbelief as Caesar advanced without resistance. For the first time since Sulla, a Roman general had brought war into Italy, but this time, the stakes were even higher. What made Caesar's move so shocking was not just the defiance of tradition, but the speed and confidence with which he acted. His soldiers adored him, and they followed without question. Many Romans, weary of senatorial corruption, even welcomed him. To them, Caesar looked less like a tyrant and more like a savior sweeping away old obstacles. But Pompey was no easy opponent. He still commanded the loyalty of many senators, had access to Rome's treasury, and could call upon the vast resources of the eastern provinces. He might have lost the capital without a fight, but he would not give up easily. And so the Republic split. Brothers, friends, even families were forced to choose: Caesar or Pompey, the man of the people or the defender of the Senate. The Rubicon had been crossed, and with it, Rome had passed the point of no return. Clash at Pharsalus and Pompey's flight. By 49 BCE, the lines were drawn. Caesar and Pompey, once allies, were now enemies locked in a struggle for Rome itself. The stakes could not have been higher. Whichever man prevailed would not just defeat his rival, he would decide the fate of the Republic. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Pompey chose to retreat. It looked at first like weakness, but Pompey had a plan. He told the Senate he could not defend Italy with unprepared forces. Instead, he withdrew south, eventually sailing to Greece. There, he could gather men, money, and ships from the eastern provinces he had once conquered. He was confident. He told his allies that all he had to do was stamp his foot and armies would appear. Pompey still believed his reputation alone was enough to crush Caesar. Caesar, however, moved fast. He swept through Italy almost unopposed, capturing towns and winning support with clemency. Instead of punishing cities that resisted him, he spared them. This generosity shocked Romans used to the brutal civil wars of the past. Caesar's strategy was as much political as military. He wanted to present himself not as a tyrant, but as the savior of Rome. By the end of the year, he controlled the capital. Still, he lacked one key thing: naval power. Pompey's fleets ruled the sea, cutting off Caesar's access to the grain supplies of Egypt and North Africa. To defeat Pompey, Caesar would have to face him in the east, on ground Pompey had chosen. In 48 BCE, the showdown came. Caesar sailed across the Adriatic with a smaller force, daring the risks of winter weather. Pompey gathered an army in Greece that dwarfed Caesar's, nearly twice as many infantry, far more cavalry, and secure supply lines. On paper, Pompey held every advantage. His allies in the Senate were certain that Caesar's doom was sealed. Cicero, who tried to stay neutral, described the war as a contest between Pompey the Great and a second Hannibal. The two armies finally met near the plain of Pharsalus in central Greece. Caesar's men, veterans hardened by a decade of war in Gaul, faced hunger, exhaustion, and inferior numbers. Yet their loyalty never wavered. Pompey, confident in his superiority, planned to use his cavalry to smash Caesar's flank and roll up his lines. It was a sound strategy. But Caesar anticipated it. He had secretly trained an extra line of reserves, men armed not with javelins, but with short stabbing swords, whose sole purpose was to meet Pompey's cavalry. When the battle began, Pompey's horsemen charged, expecting an easy rout. Instead, they were met with disciplined resistance. Caesar's reserves stabbed at faces, breaking the momentum and throwing the cavalry into chaos. With Pompey's great advantage neutralized, Caesar pressed forward. His veterans advanced like a wall, and Pompey's larger army began to crumble. The rout was total. Pompey fled the field, abandoning his men. Thousands were killed or captured. Caesar, in victory, once again showed clemency, pardoning many senators and soldiers who had fought against him. But his mercy only highlighted Pompey's disgrace. Pompey fled first to the coast, then to Egypt, hoping to find refuge with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, whose father had once been an ally. But fortune had turned against him. Fearing Caesar's wrath, Ptolemy's advisors decided to curry favor by betraying Pompey. As the great general stepped off his ship, he was murdered on the shore, stabbed in front of his wife and son. When Caesar arrived days later and was presented with Pompey's severed head, he is said to have turned away in sorrow. This was not the end he had wished for his rival. Pompey had been his ally, his son-in-law, and once the most powerful man in Rome. Now he was gone, cut down not by battle, but by treachery. With Pompey's death, Caesar was left the undisputed master of Rome. Yet peace was still far away. The Republic's civil wars were not over, and Caesar's triumph would bring new enemies and new dangers. But for now, at Pharsalus and in Pompey's tragic flight, the balance of Roman power had shifted forever. Assassination, aftermath, and the fall of the Republic. Pompey's death in Egypt might have ended the rivalry between the two giants, but it did not bring peace to Rome. Instead, it cleared the path for Caesar to rise higher than any Roman before him. With Pompey gone, Caesar was the unrivaled master of the Republic. Yet that very dominance would plant the seeds of his downfall. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria and saw Pompey's severed head, he reportedly wept. His sorrow was not only personal. Pompey had been his ally, his son-in-law, and his rival, but also political. Pompey had been a Roman consul, a man of immense dignity. To be cut down by foreign courtiers was an insult to Rome itself. Caesar had him given a proper funeral, a gesture both noble and shrewd. But Caesar's time in Egypt was not without drama. He became entangled in the civil war between young Pharaoh Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra. Caesar, ever the opportunist, sided with Cleopatra, who captivated him with her intelligence, charm, and ambition. Their alliance and love affair reshaped the politics of the Mediterranean. By 47 BCE, with Caesar's help, Cleopatra was restored to the throne, and Caesar returned to Rome with new wealth, prestige, and even a child rumored to be his son, Caesarion. Back in Rome, Caesar moved quickly to consolidate his power. He was appointed dictator, first for a temporary term, then for longer periods. By 44 BCE, he had been declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. This was unprecedented. Rome had long prided itself on avoiding kingship after expelling its last monarch centuries earlier. Yet Caesar's new title and authority looked suspiciously like the rebirth of monarchy. Caesar did not hide his ambitions. He reformed the calendar, introducing the Julian calendar we still use today. He expanded the Senate, filled it with his supporters, and launched public works to beautify Rome. He extended Roman citizenship to many provinces, tightening bonds across the Republic. To ordinary people, Caesar looked like a hero who delivered bread, festivals, and stability after years of chaos. To many senators, however, he looked like a tyrant dismantling the Republic piece by piece. The tension came to a head in 44 BCE. Rumors spread that Caesar planned to make himself king, perhaps even to march east and rule Rome like Alexander had ruled his empire. Senators who once bowed to him now whispered in secret. They called themselves liberatores, the liberators, and convinced themselves they were saving Rome. Leading them were men Caesar trusted: Brutus, whom many believed to be his illegitimate son, and Cassius, a hardened veteran of Pompey's camp. On the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate unaware of the trap. According to tradition, he was handed a petition. As he read, the conspirators closed in. Suddenly, knives flashed. Caesar was struck again and again, 23 times in all. The shock was not just the act itself, but the faces of the attackers. They were men he had pardoned after Pharsalus, men he had raised to power. Seeing Brutus among them, Caesar is said to have covered his face with his toga, no longer wishing to resist. The assassins thought they had saved the Republic. Instead, they doomed it. Rome was not freed. It was plunged into chaos. The people who had adored Caesar rioted at his funeral. Mark Antony, his loyal lieutenant, roused the crowd with a fiery speech, turning them against the conspirators. Soon, the Senate was divided again, this time between the assassins and Caesar's allies. Out of this storm rose a new generation of leaders: Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man; Lepidus, another general; and Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir and great-nephew, a young man barely 20 years old, but with iron ambition. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, vowing to avenge Caesar's death. In the years that followed, Rome endured yet more civil wars. Philippi, Actium, battles that would finally end not with the restoration of the Republic, but with the birth of an empire under Augustus. Caesar and Pompey's rivalry had begun as a contest between two men, but its legacy was far greater. It shattered the fragile Republic and set in motion the rise of emperors. Pompey had fallen in exile, Caesar by betrayal, but together their feud ended the old Rome forever. The Republic was dead. In its place, a new Rome would rise, ruled not by senators and consuls, but by emperors who traced their power back to the struggles of these two giants. The feud that changed the world. Some rivalries end with victory and defeat. Others echo through the ages, reshaping everything that comes after. The feud between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great was one of those. It was not just a contest between two ambitious men. It was the struggle that broke a republic and gave birth to an empire. When Caesar and Pompey first joined forces, their alliance looked unstoppable. Together with Crassus, they dominated Roman politics, dividing offices and commands between themselves. But power shared is power contested. And beneath the surface, both men were too ambitious to remain equals. Pompey had been Rome's greatest general, the conqueror of the East. Caesar, daring and hungry, was rising fast. Their friendship was doomed the moment their interests no longer aligned. What began as rivalry soon hardened into suspicion, and suspicion into war. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul gave him wealth, soldiers, and glory that overshadowed Pompey. Pompey, drifting closer to the Senate, became the defender of tradition against Caesar's disruptive popularity. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he was not just defying Pompey, he was defying the Republic itself. The war that followed was as much psychological as military. Pompey's armies were larger, richer, better supplied. Caesar's were smaller, hungrier, but fiercely loyal. Pompey hesitated, cautious, trying to play the long game. Caesar struck boldly, gambling everything on speed, risk, and the devotion of his veterans. At Pharsalus, those differences decided the outcome. And yet, even in victory, Caesar lost. For though Pompey was gone, Caesar's dominance frightened Rome more than Pompey's ever had. The Republic had survived countless crises, but it could not survive one man towering above all others. When the knives of the Senate fell on Caesar, they were wielded in the name of liberty. But liberty did not return. Instead, the civil wars dragged on until Caesar's heir, Octavian, emerged as Augustus, the first emperor. This is why the feud between Caesar and Pompey stands apart from other great rivalries in history. It was not just personal, it was structural. It revealed the cracks in Rome's political system, cracks that no compromise could mend. The Republic had been built for a city-state, not for an empire stretching from Spain to Syria. Caesar and Pompey were products of that imbalance, men too big for the offices they held, fighting over a state that could no longer contain them. History is full of rivalries that shape nations. Hamilton versus Burr in America, Churchill versus Hitler in World War II, Mandela versus apartheid in South Africa. But few have had consequences as sweeping as Caesar versus Pompey. Their struggle ended a system of government that had lasted for centuries and set the stage for nearly 500 years of imperial rule. In the end, neither man lived to enjoy the world they remade. Pompey was betrayed on a foreign shore, Caesar murdered by his own Senate. Yet their legacies endure, carved into marble and memory. Pompey, the great general who rose too early and faltered too late. Caesar, the conqueror whose ambition outgrew the Republic itself. Their feud was not just about who would rule Rome, it was about what Rome would become. And from that clash, the Republic died and an empire was born.